All right, so our notes today are about the New Deal, President Roosevelt's signature reform package to address the Great Depression. So first off, Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933. And when he ran for president in 32, he ran on this promise of a New Deal for the American people. And in particular, he had in mind a number of steps he believed the government should take to tackle the Great Depression. If you remember, President Hoover had largely kept the government out of it, had decided that private organizations, churches, charities should be where people turn to if they need help, but that otherwise we would kind of leave businesses alone and we would leave the economy alone and sort of ride it out. FDR, on the other hand, wanted to use the power of the national government to help people get back on their feet and to get the economy moving again. He believed that only the national government would have enough power, enough resources to be able to tackle the problem. And Roosevelt very wisely used the popular media of the radio to sell his plans to the public. He would go on and give short radio addresses that Americans all across the country would tune into and hear on their radios. And these became known as fireside chats. Right? Roosevelt would, talk as if he were sitting right there in your living room, right? Just having a chat with you. And this really endeared him to the American people. And it really gave him a chance to explain why he felt the actions that the government was taking were good for America. So some of the major New Deal programs that were passed by Congress and created by Roosevelt included, and there's a lot, I'm just going to go over some of the main ones. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. What this did is promised that the government would insure bank deposits up to $5,000. If you remember, when the Depression started, there were these runs on the banks. And people wiped out all of the money in banks, and the banks just had no choice but to shut down. They didn't have a safety net. They didn't have the government backing them up. And now with the FDIC, the government says, hey, if you put up to $5,000 into a bank account and something goes wrong, the government will back that up. The government will promise that you can still get that money. So that provided a lot of comfort to Americans and helped to really stabilize the banking system. The Securities and Exchanges Commission, SEC. This provided the government with more power to regulate the stock market so that crazy up and down of the 1920s going higher until the stock market crashed in 1929. The government would have some more oversight, would be able to try to regulate things so we wouldn't have that happen again. The National Recovery Administration. This was a program where, kind of simplified, but the government worked together with business owners to do a couple of things. Regulate the economy, protect workers' rights, including the right to join a labor union, and reduce unemployment. So the government took a greater step in working with businesses to try to address those problems. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The government actually paid farmers to reduce the number of crops they were planting. Sounds kind of strange, right? But the problem was, farmers were in debt. They were, to make more money, they were growing more crops, but this was flooding the market with more crops than were needed. So the price was dropping. And so the government actually paid farmers not to plant crops. Said, listen, we'll help you cover some of your costs, but don't just plant as much as you can. And that would allow the farmers to get that income that they needed, and it would help raise the price of crops to where they really should have been before the market got flooded with all these extra crops. So that helped farmers out. The Rural Electrification Administration. The government put people to work connecting farms across the country to power grids. Really brought power to the rural areas of America. One of the biggest New Deal programs was the Social Security Act. And again, it's a little more complicated than this, but basically the simplified version of this is that the government promised to provide financial assistance for old age, right? That every American would get a Social Security number, and throughout your life, you would put money into Social Security. And when you hit retirement, when you hit old age, the government would then provide some money every month to help you out. The New Deal was also known for work programs. There were a lot of programs that put Americans to work. We had a lot of Americans who were unemployed, right? At one point, upwards of about 25% of Americans were unemployed. So Roosevelt said, you know what? Let's hire them to work on these government programs. People want to work. Let's put them to work. So some of the most famous programs, the Tennessee Valley Authority, that built dams along the Tennessee River, right? And this is through, Tennessee, kind of Arkansas, sort of that area there. And so there were some construction jobs building dams that would help provide hydroelectric power to an area of the country that really needed it. There was the Civilian Conservation Corps, and this put people to work on environmental projects, right? Planting trees, shoring up natural resources and making it so that people could get out and enjoy nature, right? Lots of people put to work for the CCC. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, over 3 million Americans got jobs through the WPA, building bridges, public buildings, parks, roads, right? Just basically saying, hey, there are things that we could build here to make America better. We have a whole lot of Americans who need jobs. Let's put the two together and put people to work making America better connected, to build up America. Now, not everybody was wild about the New Deal. There were some critics of the New Deal. So conservative critics, we're talking about Republicans here. Remember, Roosevelt is a Democrat. Conservative critics said that the New Deal cost too much and it gave the government too much power, right? Conservatives tend to want a smaller national government. They don't want the national government to be too powerful, and they felt like the New Deal wasted money and made the national government too powerful. So a political cartoon that comes out of the textbook here, right, sort of highlights that it shows the conservative viewpoint where the poor taxpayers are dumping millions and millions and millions of dollars into this New Deal, and Roosevelt's just hoping that it works, but it's leaking everywhere, right? This would be the conservative view of the New Deal. Liberal critics, here we're talking about Democrats who are, kind of on the extremes of the Democratic Party. They argued that the New Deal wasn't doing enough, that it should be doing way more. There should be more programs, more money being spent to help the poor and the unemployed. So Roosevelt's getting criticism from both sides about his New Deal program. And then there was the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court kept striking down New Deal programs. And that really frustrated Roosevelt, right? He would come up with these programs, and then people would challenge those programs in court and say they're unconstitutional. And for a while, the Supreme Court kept striking them down, saying, no, the government's not allowed to do that. The government's not allowed to have these programs. This goes against the Constitution. Eventually, the Supreme Court changed its mind. And by 1937, it started to uphold the New Deal. It's kind of an interesting storyline where Roosevelt actually threatened to change the number of judges on the Supreme Court from 9 to 15. He said the judges are too old, they can't keep up with their work, and there were a lot of older justices on the court. And he threatened to, if they didn't retire, to add more judges to the court. And of course, the president gets to pick who goes on the Supreme Court. And so this cartoon shows kind of a positive view of that, where he's telling this older judge, hey, you need to retire or get out of the way. In reality, the American people didn't really like Roosevelt's plan. They thought he should leave the Supreme Court alone. Congress actually didn't go for it. But the Supreme Court did decide, it changed its mind and started upholding the New Deal programs. So it sort of made it where he didn't need to add any more judges to the court anyway. So the New Deal ended up having a mixed impact on Americans. Talk about several different groups of Americans. It was helpful for some, but it wasn't helpful for all Americans. And for a lot of groups, there were maybe some positives, but some not so positives too. One group that it was pretty good for was workers. Right? Workers, through the New Deal, gained more rights, and they gained the ability to form labor unions. Right? Those labor unions gained protection from the government. In the New Deal, the government really, which had been siding with business owners, sort of takes a step back and decides to side with workers more often. Women didn't really get a lot from it. One thing they did get was the government started to hire more women under the New Deal. In fact, more than ever before. But a lot of women, through the Depression and through the New Deal years, wound up losing jobs that they had as business owners sort of shoved them aside to make way for men. They would take jobs that women had and fire the women and instead hire a man for those jobs. For African Americans, it was also mixed. New Deal programs helped African Americans get jobs and to get back on their feet, some. But the government didn't do much to address the problems of racism, segregation, discrimination. And in particular, the government failed to address the problem of lynching. Congress actually came up with an anti-lynching law, but Roosevelt would not sign it. He would not support it because he was worried about losing the support of Southerners. So African Americans got a pretty mixed impact from the New Deal as well. For Native Americans, there were some positives. The government took steps to improve education and health care for Native American groups, and Native American tribes were allowed to establish their own tribal governments. So they were given a little bit more autonomy, more independence. Now, those were steps in the right direction, but you got to remember too that our treatment of Native American tribes has always been pretty poor. So it was a step in the right direction, but there was still a long way to go, and still is today. And then the last group we'll talk about is Mexican Americans. As farming jobs dried up and farmers were actually being paid not to plant as many crops, Mexican Americans who had been relying on those farming jobs relocated. It hurt Mexican Americans in a lot of ways. And they would relocate to cities where a lot of times they struggled, or lots actually left for Mexico. So there's sort of a mixed impact of different groups. But the big picture here is that Roosevelt's New Deal programs changed the way Americans looked at the role of the national government. Under the New Deal, the government took a lot more actions, took a lot more control over the economy and people's lives. And while it didn't solve the Great Depression, it did help a lot of people. And so Americans start to become more accepting of a bigger, more powerful national government. Make sure that you fill in all the bullet points on your notes with the information from the slides, and then make sure you answer the response question that goes along with this set of notes as well.